Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Ablecraft, and as you can see behind me, we have a golden carrot in the shopping district. Now of course in the last episode we built the mending shop. I haven't checked to see if we've had any sales yet, but I thought I would get going on this episode by creating a golden carrot shop, as that is something that we also get from villagers. Now, the pixel art itself isn't my own design. I will credit that on screen right now. But the making it 3D is certainly my own design, and I have adapted it a little bit so that you can walk inside and you're surrounded by chests here. You've got this little chandelier, and in the chests we're going to be putting a load of golden carrots. Now we don't have any stock yet, but the price is just going to be 1 diamond or equivalent per stack. So let's go gather some stock. But before we do that, shall we have a look at our mending books? What do you reckon? Do you think we've had some sales? I'm sure we have. Let's have a look. Oh, that's really good. 36 diamonds. Damn, we're going to need to restock this. So, I need to get restocking, and we need to get on with the episode. So, I'm just over here gathering golden carrots, trading pumpkins and melons with the villagers, and then getting emeralds and getting golden carrots from that. And this is what we've got so far. But we're going to need a lot more. So while I'm doing this, let me show you a montage of clips that happened with me and Fredo on a live stream where we went to defeat the Ender Dragon and then went End City raiding. Not Ender City raiding. Anyway, roll the clips. There we go. And found it. We're going to jump in 3, 2, 1, go. There we go. Okay. I can't see that. Okay, it's a relatively safe one. Not yet. Very hard to see. There we go, got it. I'm going to turn down my Minecraft sounds. Ah! Oh my god. Water. Oh no. Okay. You should be able to come back in and get your stuff. Oh no. Deathloop. Is that really the first time you've fired a bow? I don't want to be standing in here. Oh, I water bucket clutched. Is that it? Is there one more? Nice. There we go. Oh, I didn't give you the advancement. XP! So if I just throw an ender pearl through and then hold shift, yeah. Okay, you can do the same, just hold shift the moment you go through. I know. Oh! End City. Let's go. Go in, kill shulkers, get out. What could go wrong? And I'm already floating. Hey. And of course, the dragon head. Got it. I'm a dragon. Rah! You okay? Oh no. Okay, just bear with me just a moment. Oh, diamonds. Okay. Let me just get rid of the immediate ones that are here. There's one there. Where did you die? Do you know?
In a big room.
Okay. Keep the coordinates somewhere. Just make a note of them. Jesus. Okay, just keep... okay, up we go in then. I see why this is a problem. Okay, I see your stuff. Getting to it is another matter. Okay, I want to try and just get up to here at least. Okay. Got some chests up here that I'll be able to use. That's good. Okay, any more? I can hear some. Oh. There's one down there. Okay, let's end a pearl down to there. And start picking up all the stuff. 10 on hitboxes. I really hope that hasn't despawned in this time. Oh gosh, where is it all? Oh, it's despawned. Now. Yes! Okay, get that. There'll be one in here. Got you an elytra.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, all that's left for me to do is to jump into the void. I don't want to do it. Nothing in my inventory. Everything is in my ender chest. Everything valuable is in my ender chest. See you soon. Bye-bye 73 levels. So we've got a fair bit of stock of golden carrots, and I think this is something that I'm going to do off camera and just kind of between episodes when I feel like it, because it's going to be quite a grind to keep this stocked and also to get all of these chests filled. But as you saw in the montage, Fredo did of course die in the end and lost all of their stuff, and we weren't able to pick it up in time, which is why some of these sales in the mending shop are so much. So I've got to restock this as well, which again is something I will do off camera. But let's go back to our base and have a look at the loot that we got. So unfortunately, the footage that I recorded that showed off all of the loot got corrupted, but I did manage to salvage this screenshot. And as you can see, we got over a stack of shulker shells, of course, as well as the elytra and some other goodies. We did split it all 50-50 with Fredo and gave them some of the armor and tools and things so that they could get kitted up again. But yeah, a pretty decent haul considering. So, of course, we now have access to shulker boxes, and I have organised my storage and started to put some shulker boxes in my ender chest, but that doesn't make fun content. What does make fun content is this. We've got an elytra. So let's put that on like that. We've got very limited rockets, and let's go for a flight over the server. So if we just look back, this is our little area here. Not much is happening so far, but I do have big plans. Got our cool little starter base though. And then if we head over here, we've got Fredo's starter base, and Fredo is actually working on something really cool over here, so we'll have to wait and see what that is. Then just over here, as the world loads in, we have Fredo's starter area and the shopping area here. The golden carrot looks so cool. And then we've got a little skelly spawner just under there. And over here, we've got the village that we started out in episode 1. Now, obviously, we're just getting going. This whole area is going to expand enormously, and I'm so excited. But also, we've got an elytra. I'm burning through these rockets so quickly, but hey, we've got an elytra. We can do shots like this now. Looks really cool. Now, if we just take a peek in some of our resources, we're doing really well on diamonds. Emeralds will gradually build up. Redstone, we're doing good. Copper, we're doing amazing. Got a whole shulker box there. Gold, we can eventually set up a gold farm. Coal, we're doing amazing. But a resource that we don't have much of, I say that, and I open this chest and there's a ton of it, but iron goes really quickly. So what I want to do this episode is build an iron farm. So I'm going to go gather some of those resources and figure out how an iron farm works, and I'll see you in a moment. So in order to build our iron farm, I want to build it underground, and in order to do that, we need a beacon. So I have been grinding for the last few hours, and I've managed to get 3 wither skeleton skulls. Now, I could do a big wither fight, but I don't think I'm ready for that yet, and I think that will end in chaos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it under the end portal. Now, on stream, we obviously defeated the Ender Dragon and got the Elytra, as I mentioned earlier. So this is a really cool way of utilising this portal. And what you do is you spawn the wither like this. As you can see, that's my first time spawning the wither. And we step back just in case it explodes for a moment, and hopefully this works. Yep. And then we can see that it is trapped under the bedrock here. I'll just turn down my sounds. There we go. And we can see that it's trapped under the bedrock. So all we have to do is we come up and we just hit it like this, and it cannot escape, and it's a very easy way of getting a nether star. And there we go. We got the nether star. And we also got a wither head and a blue wither projectile head. That's pretty cool. Of course, on the server we have a data pack that allows us to get mob heads and things. So that's pretty cool. And we've got the most important thing, the nether star. Nice and easy, no chaos. So once I got the nether star, I crafted a beacon, which came in handy for clearing out the large area required to make sure that iron golems only spawn where we want to. Now, when clearing out a large area like this, a beacon is almost essential, because could you imagine how long this would have taken me if I didn't have a beacon? And of course this is sped up. But now, back to me. So I've now dug all of that out, and if we just head all the way down here, just like this, we have this massive area that we're going to build an iron farm in. Now, what we've got to do is, obviously, there'll be a village and a zombie here, and they'll be in the center. And then we can't have any spawnable blocks where iron golems could potentially spawn. So all of this is going to have to be half slabbed and lit up. So we've got a fair few resources to gather, and let's do a resource gathering montage. So it turns out we actually had all of the resources already in our sorting system, and it was just a case of crafting and smelting some stuff, and that didn't make for very good content. So what I've gone and done is I've built the farm, well, some of it anyway, but now comes the interesting bits. We've got to get one zombie in here and name tag them, and we've got to get some villagers in here. We've got to get the zombie first, so we're going to have to wait for night time and then get the zombie in. So let's see if we can do that. So there's a zombie just over there behind that tree. I don't know if there's going to be a closer one, so let's see if we can get them to chase us. Here, zombie, zombie. Here, zombie, zombie. Look at me. Yep, start tracking me. Now I've just got to get back to the base. I'm not going to name tag him yet, just in case he, for some reason, despawns or doesn't make it. Go on, ignore the pig, it's fine. Okay, and then come down here. Brilliant. No, look at me. Nope, to me. There we go. And then we've got this little dirt scaffolding thing here. Oh, where have you gone? No, come back down. Thank you. You're meant to be the easy part of this. Okay. And walk, and fall. There we go. And now we can name him Bert for Zombert. Now we've got to get the villagers in. This could be fun. I'm over here at our village that we had in episode 1. And of course now you can put a boat on a lead. So we're going to try this together. And if it fails, we either take them by river around there, or we try and minecart them through the nether. So are you going to come this way? We just need to catch, I'd like to catch 2 in a boat if possible. This could take a while. Maybe we put some composters down just to see. Oh, we got 1. I don't want to catch you. No. Oh. Well, that's annoying. I wonder what happens with the llamas, actually. This could be quite funny. I'll just seal that like that. This is probably going to break some leads. And now let's pillar up. Yeah, I think they're dangling off the ground. Right, let's just see if this will work. Nope, didn't work at all. Oh, this could take a while. So after much wrangling and headaches, we sorted it out, and we've now got 3 villagers in there and 1 zombie in there, and we can get on and build the rest of the farm. That's it, that's the farm all built. And as we're seeing in front of us, we're seeing iron golems spawn. They get pulled in the water stream and then they burn in the lava, and at the moment it just goes into these hoppers. But what we'll add now is a item filter and an auto crafter. I've added an item filter to take out the poppies. It's a bit hard to see, but it's just buried under there. It's a classic Impulse SV item filter, and currently all of the poppies will end up in this chest here. And then all of the iron will get passed through onto this auto crafter, and then it fires a circuit, compares it against this, and then crafts it all into iron blocks. And as you can see, we're getting quite a lot so far. Now, this farm here is designed by Wattles, so I will of course leave a link in the description down below. Please go check them out. It's an amazing design. So far it's been working flawlessly as I've been building this, but all of this little bit is my own design with a little combination of circuits that I know. But please go check out Wattles. Again, link is in the description down below. But unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today. So if you liked the video, then please do give it a like. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching. Bye!